In this exercise, I'm going to modify the model by adding a country field to the address class and a bill to address to the order class. Simple changes, but they affect the database schema. Along the way, you'll learn about the support that Code First has for these kinds of changes and how you can change its behavior. Alright, so the first thing I'm going to do is come here to the address class, and I'm going to add a public string and call it country. Okay, so I'm adding a property to the class, which means that I needed an additional field within the database. And then I'll come down here to order, and I'm going to add a public virtual address and call it bill to address. And then I'm also going to remove this address ID. This actually would be a bit confusing if I left it in, because I'm going to end up with an address ID that is going to be a foreign key, but when you look at the table, well, which one? The ship to address or the bill to address? Okay. I don't actually need it within my application, so I'm just going to get rid of that. Okay, so that makes the model clearer in that case. Alright, so I'll save my work. All I've done again is change the model. In a real application, might have to change code in the controller, but I'd certainly need to change the code within the views because I have this additional field within customers. And any other views were affected by the application. Unfortunately, MVC doesn't automatically pick up that you've changed the model. Maybe in a future version. Alright, so I'll go ahead and run the application. Keeping in mind I've made changes to my model. And kablam! I get an error message. So, invalid operation exception was unhandled by user code. An exception, invalid operation exception occurred in blah blah blah. The model backing, the ordering context, has changed since the database was created. So you can see that in the tooltip. Consider using Code First migrations to update the database. Okay, I get that, because Code First is smart enough to see that the model no longer corresponds to the database schema. Now, I'm not going to talk about code migrations, which is a newer feature of Code First, but I'm going to talk about some other options that you have in order to handle this kind of situation. And by the way, I got this dialog box here with the exception because I have exceptions configured within Visual Studio in a particular way. I think they're the default settings if I recall correctly. But you can change those settings, and so you may actually get what's called the ASP.NET yellow screen of death that displays the exception. So it just depends on how you have Visual Studio configured. So don't be too alarmed if the error message is displayed within the browser. It just means you have your settings configured differently than mine. Neither's better, just different. Alright, so there's 4 ways to fix the problem. The first is that you can use a tool like Management Studio to manually delete the database and rerun the application. Code First will recreate the database the next time you run the application, just like it created it the first time, the very first time that I ran the application. Okay, so that's a little draconian, but it's workable. Secondly, you can manually update the database schema so that it again corresponds to the model. This can be a little tricky because Code First creates 2 underscores migration history table in the database with a hash of the shape of the model that was used to create it. And Code First uses that hash in order to detect the changes. If you delete that table, then Entity Framework will assume you know what you're doing and not compare the current model with the current database schema. So if you want to turn off that feature of Code First, fine. But then you're taking things in your own hands, and you need to keep the database and the model in sync. Okay, so doable, and in some scenarios that might be, some situations that might be the way to go, but you're kind of turning off a lot of what Code First can do for you. The third option is to use a Code First development feature to automatically recreate the database whenever the model changes, without any manual intervention from you. And that's, in fact, going to be the first option that I'm going to show you. All right, and then the fourth option, as was mentioned in that exception message, is that you can use code-first migrations. I'm not going to cover that here. That's a whole different topic for handling this. All right, now the automatic database recreation feature is particularly useful in the early stages of application development, when your model is changing almost with every build. It gives you the flexibility to refactor and restructure your application and the model code as often and however you want. There is a bit of an overhead to drop and recreate the database, particularly if you're doing it every time you run it, particularly if the database is real complicated, because it can take some time to recreate all those objects. Now, again, I'm talking about that code-first feature in order to automatically recreate the database. So you have three options. You actually have four, but I'm not going to talk about the fourth here. So the first is create database if not exists. And this is actually a class that you use in a particular way that I'll show you within your code. So what this option does, as the name suggests, is that if it doesn't exist, it creates the database. That's the only time that it creates the database. The database already exists, it doesn't drop it. Second option is drop create database always. So in this case, every time you run the application, it's going to drop the database and recreate it. A little extreme, but for the first few iterations of developing an application may make perfect sense. If you're changing the schema extensively every time, then this might be an option that makes sense. And then later you can change to something else. None of these are set in stone for the life of the application. You can bounce between them. And then the third one is drop create database if model changes. So again, it drops and recreates the database if code first detects that the model has changed since the database was created. And this uses that hash that is stored within that table in the database. Okay, again, there's a fourth option for migrations, but that's another topic. The easiest way to enable this feature to automatically recreate the database is to add a database.setInitializer method call when the application starts up. So in a web application, the application_start event method in global.asax would be a good place for it. You might put it in the main method in other types of applications, such as a console application. So just put it wherever the code will run when the application starts. So let's take a look at how you can do this within our ASP.NET MVC application. Here I am back within the application with that nasty exception still showing. All right, so I'm going to cancel out of that, cancel execution. And I'm going to put this code, as I mentioned, in the global.asax file, which fortunately MVC created for me. Okay, so it's actually global.asax.cs. And of course, in a VB application, it'd be .vb. And I already have some code within application start because MVC needs to execute some code on startup to create any area registrations. That's an MVC feature, as well as to configure the routes. Another MVC, well, it's really not an MVC feature, it's part of ASP.NET, but it helps you configure nice URLs through your application. Now, this code that I'm going to write is going to use some stuff from system.data.entity, so I'm going to add a reference to that up here as a new using statement. And then I'm going to add this piece of code, this single statement. I'll do Control-KD so my tabs are aligned. Here at the beginning of application starts. So again, application start executes anytime I start this application. All right, so I'm going to use the database object, which is part of that system.data.entity namespace. And I'll use the setInitializer. And I need to specify the context class. So I'm going to use ordering context. Oh, actually, ordering.models. I didn't include a using statement for this, although I could. And specify the ordering context. And then I new up an object of the type of initializer that I want to use. In this case, I'm going to use the drop create database if model changes initializer. So I'll select that from the list. And I need to specify once again the context object. So it's ordering.models.ordering context. Newing it up, so I need to include the parentheses. Okay, so there's my statement. Let me make this a little bit easier to read there. Okay, so what that's doing, because I'm setting the initializer to this drop create database if model changes, this modifies code first default behavior and is only going to drop and recreate the database if the model changes. Okay, so that's all the change that I need to make. Save my change. I'm not in a view, so I can execute the code directly from here. And it takes a bit of a while because it's doing the work of dropping and recreating the database, assuming I didn't do anything wrong. And I get an exception. The exception here is that it can't drop the database because it's currently in use. Okay. The reason it's currently in use is because I have it open within Management Studio. Now, most of the time, just navigating away from this, unless I have any code windows that are open and so forth, is sufficient. I'm going to try that, but it's not always sufficient because sometimes Management Studio hangs on to references of database objects. So we'll see if that's the case here or if I'm lucky. And it's taking a bit of time, so I'm guessing that I'm not lucky today. Okay, I'm not lucky today. So I'm going to stop execution, come over here, Management Studio, just shut it down, and try again. Now usually this works. Sometimes it doesn't work because Visual Studio actually has a reference to the database. Oh, take two. But sometimes even that doesn't work because Visual Studio has a reference to the database. Okay, so we didn't have to go to that extreme. But if that were the case, if I got the exception again, I would just shut down Visual Studio, restart it, open up the project, and then that pretty much always takes care of it. Okay, so what happened here is that saw the model changed, it dropped the database, recreated it according to the schema, the revised schema, because I added country to the thing as well as the bill to address to those two classes within the ordering model. But I no longer have my customer record because I dropped it. It was deleted. And I don't have any code that actually automatically creates that. So a little bit of a downside. And I can go back into Management Studio here, reconnect to my local instance of SQL Server 2014, look at my database, still exists. If I looked at the time information on the database, it would show me it was just created. And if I look at addresses, I can see that I now have a country field. And here in orders, I now have a bill to address in addition to the ship to address. And just to make crystal clear, if I come here to customers, right click, select the top 1,000 rows, I deleted the database, so I no longer have any data there.